We have Ian Fleming, John le Carré, Graham Greene, all those spies turned authors. In the world of espionage, the line between fact and fiction can sometimes be pretty blurred. But who were the Soviet equivalents of those guys? Who were the writers of spy fiction in the Soviet Union? And what was the relationship between the KGB and its fictional chroniclers? And what role did fiction play in encouraging a young KGB recruit called Vladimir Putin? My name's Antonia Senior, and this is the Spymasters podcast. And I'm delighted to have on board today Filip Kovacevic. He's an academic, he's based in America, and he's a Substacker with a keen eye for brilliant stories about intelligence. I'll put the details of Filip's Substack in the show notes, obviously. But Filip has a book out, which we're going to be talking about today, called KGB Literati. It's going to answer all those questions and more, and it's a fantastic conversation, so dive right in. And just before you do that, do think about following us, subscribing, showing us some love so we can keep bringing you all the best writers talking about spies. And now I'm going to hand you over to me, talking to Filip about KGB Literati. Filip, thank you so much for coming on the Spymasters podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, we're massively looking forward to talking to you. So we're here today to talk about your book, KGB Literati, Spy Fiction and State Security in the Soviet Union. Now, Filip, I was so excited to get you on because, as you know, this podcast does spy fiction and non-fiction. And I've always been fascinated by the blurring of lines between those two things, the way that, unlike in other kind of literary genres, the fiction bleeds into the real life stuff and the real life stuff appears back again in the fiction. And that kind of relationship between them was so fluid. And imagine my excitement when I discovered that there was a book written by you coming out which looked at exactly that, but from the Soviet perspective. It's so cool. So can you just explain to listeners who are new to your work a little bit about the book and what it's about?
Well, thank you so much for your kind words. Yeah, I mean, fiction, I mean, what is the power of fiction, power of literature? Literature can shape our reality. And so I was interested at looking how this specific genre of fiction shaped certain political, ideological issues during the Cold War. And I decided to look at spy fiction written by KGB officers because I saw in this not simply some people creatively trying to understand their reality, but also I saw this influence, the power of the government trying to influence the hearts and minds of the people. And I noticed that there was no book about this subject. There were so many books about Western spies who became writers, people like Ian Fleming and John le Carré and Somerset Maugham and Graham Greene and John Buchan, and the list is endless. And this is just in the UK. In the US, you have another group of great writers today. Think about former CIA officers like Alma Katsu, Ilana Berry, David McCloskey. They've had this experience of being inside the spying business, and now they're out there writing stories about it. And I was interested in what happened on the other side of the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. Did they have these former spies, former counter-spies writing spy fiction? How was this spy fiction created, organized, distributed, put together? Who was behind it? And so I was trying to find the main protagonist of this effort from the other side. Of course, we have to understand, Soviet Union, of course, was not a democracy, so everything was controlled in the Soviet Union. And so spy fiction in the Soviet Union was also controlled. It was essentially an instrument to shape the hearts and mind of the Soviet people, to make them understand that the KGB is not there to be against them, but to protect them. It was a way for the KGB to create the image of being, your friendly defensive service protecting you from the outside enemies. Whereas in fact, KGB was spying on everybody and was really strictly holding to the orthodoxy of the communist ideology, not letting anybody stray from it.
Filip, before we get into the detail of the book, can you just tell me a little bit about you? So how did you come to the place where you're writing this book? What's your background? And why this particular topic grabbed you? Why are you the person who wrote this story?
I'm a university professor. I've taught for 25 years in different places in the world, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, now in the United States. And I was teaching subjects connected to politics and history, but I've always been interested in literature, in the power of literature, of how literature can shape reality. And so I always, as I was doing social science and things connected to it, I read a lot of books, spy fiction and other genres, of course. And I was thinking, gee, let's see if I can do a book that combines the two, reality and fiction, and how they interplay with each other. And so I came upon this idea and looked around and noticed that there was no book about this at all. Not at all, not even in Russia. It's just kind of this field. This was like forgotten even in Russia. So I decided to do something that would be an original contribution to the field, and also get access to so many books that have been out of print. They have been out of print. But I have to say something that now, because Russia of today is essentially coming back into its Soviet past, it's kind of bringing back its Soviet past. And so many of the books that I talk about in my book are now being republished, reissued in Russia. So imagine, this is an amazing thing, I thought I was writing about Russia's past in my book, but actually it turns out that I'm writing about Russia's present, and even more disturbingly about Russian future. Isn't that amazing? Because so many of the people running Russia today have come out of this KGB milieu, and this is something I really want to stress: is that to understand them, the KGB mentality. It's so important to understand the culture that they operated within, that these officers operated within. And this book, I think, provides a great access to the culture, to the values, to the aspirations, to the even fears of the KGB. What did they want to accomplish? What did they want to accomplish in the Soviet Union and outside of the Soviet Union? And I have to say, I mean, this is not an academic debate. This is something you see on the news, because former KGB officers, are running Russia today. Vladimir Putin, and he's not the only one. There's just a group of them, and I can name all of them: Nikolai Patrushev, Alexander Bortnikov, Sergei Narishkin, Igor Sechin, Sergei Ivanov. They all came out of this milieu of KGB produced literature. In fact, I have a quote. Here is what Vladimir Putin said in an interview. He said, "My notion of the KGB came from romantic spy stories. I was a pure and utterly successful product of Soviet patriotic education." So in other words, there he says it. He is a product of these books that my book is about, and that you can read about for the first time in English, because actually most of them have never been translated into English. So the first access the readers can get to them is in my book. Of course, I encourage them to do explorations on their own, and perhaps people will be encouraged to translate these books into English after having read my analysis of them in my book.
I mean, you do very thoroughly lay out the plots of some of these as part of the kind of your attempt to sort of work out where they fit into the kind of wider KGB culture. And you do point out as well that you're not the only person who's paying attention to spy fiction, because the CIA were also watching this stuff, weren't they? I mean, this stuff might not be in English, but the CIA realized how useful it was as a window on the soul of the KGB.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's something amazing I came across. I noticed that I had predecessors in this business of studying Soviet spy fiction, and I found documents from the 1960s where the KGB is actually writing to the MI6 in the UK and telling them, pay attention to the spy stories coming out of the Soviet Union, because they show that the KGB is gaining in stature in Russian society. In other words, CIA analysts use spy fiction as a sort of early open source analysis. It's like open. What can this tell you about the processes going on in Soviet society? Because remember, the Soviet Union was a closed country. It was a country that was really difficult to get access to really anything. Even the Soviet citizens had no idea what was going on in the country itself. We are talking. Some scholars have called the Soviet Union a secret leviathan. There were secret cities, entire cities, completely secret. And so many things were secret. So in other words, having something in the public sphere, like fiction, was a way to understand what's going on. And so the CIA analysts in the 1960s noticed that there were these stories glorifying state security officers coming out into public. They were saying, well, hey, this is a new trend. This means that that the KGB is gaining influence in Soviet society. And this was something really important because KGB had its own understanding of the world. It was connected to the Communist Party, of course, but it was also essentially conspiratorial. And this is something that's very important to understand. It's that this mentality that looks at the world as a source of danger and looks at, let's say, the Soviet Union or Russia as a fortress that's besieged by all sides from the outside and also internally. And so, in other words, everywhere you look at their enemies. And so and this is what you find in KGB spy fiction, this effort to make Soviet citizens vigilant, to make them vigilant about the threats inside and outside, of course, from the viewpoint of Soviet ideology and Soviet state security. So in other words, manipulation to see enemies where perhaps they did not exist. But this was useful to keep the Communist Party in power, and with the Communist Party also the KGB. Because what we need to understand is that the KGB was essentially, they were the guardians of the Soviet system. The Communist Party, essentially, from the perspective of political theory, we can look at Soviet Union as some kind of degraded, debased Plato's republic, a dictatorship where you have the philosopher kings at the top. That's the Communist Party leadership. You have the guardians, that's the KGB, and then you have the people being manipulated. Just like in Plato's republic, the people are manipulated, and so in the Soviet Union also, they are not told what they are essentially looking at these shadows on the wall and being told, well, this is the real thing. So in the Soviet Union, you had the KGB as the guardians. They were the guardians. And now in post-Soviet Russia, to make this giant leap, they got rid of the philosopher kings and they are in charge themselves. In other words, it's like the arms becoming the head, and then behaving, without some kind of coherent ideology, hitting here and there. And this is essentially what we are seeing. But we are also seeing at the same time a coherent, almost a secret society running the whole thing. That's also something very important to understand. This aspect of inner coherence and allegiance to the KGB. There is a statement.
Yeah.
There is no former Chekist, and of course that's not accurate in all cases. But in many cases it is. There is this commitment to the set of values and relationships within the KGB. And this is why they seem to be so successful in seizing and staying in power right now in Russia. This is something we can come back to. And I also see this in spy fiction. I was able to essentially discern certain structures in the way stories are presented that I think say a lot about the KGB mentality, the way KGB officers were taught to think about the world and their position in the world.
So you effectively divide the sort of the evolution of this spy fiction into various periods, and the first is the immediate post-war period, where it's kind of enthusiastic veterans and it's sort of not a kind of official kind of part of the KGB at all, but they're all still, they have a kind of very strong anti-American kind of vibe. There's a very, very, it was specifically a Soviet alternative to the type of stuff that was coming out of the West. And there was an initial spy writer who you focus in on quite heavily called Roman Kim. Can you tell people a little bit about him?
Yes. The idea was to create an alternative to Western spy fiction. And Roman Kim was an officer, counterintelligence officer, with very interesting biography. He was a Korean. He was born in the Russian Empire in Vladivostok to Korean parents who were exiles from Korea after Japan took over Korea. And he was from the beginning, he was connected to this milieu of Japanese diplomats and Korean expatriates in the Russian Empire. And then he was sent to Japan to get educated, came back to the Soviet Union and began working for the Cheka, for the first Soviet State Security Service, and then was essentially recruited, was called to Moscow, and became a counterintelligence officer targeting the Japanese diplomats in Moscow. And so from the very beginning, there's this counterintelligence perspective from the very beginning, kind of KGB spy fiction. That's very important to keep in mind, because in the end,
that's the conspiratorial thing you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. It was conspiratorial, and the idea was that spy fiction is not simply a creative understanding of reality. It has a function. And this function was to shape the hearts and minds of populations to understand who the enemies were. And so Kim from the beginning worked in this field of kind of defending the Soviet Union against outside influences. And then he realized that he could do it so well by writing fictional narratives that would portray these dangers in a very dramatic way. He essentially wanted to dramatize the situation and to influence, especially the young readers, to see the world as a place where Soviet interests are under attack, and how they themselves could contribute to helping the Soviet Union. So he was widely read. He spoke so many languages, including French and English, and he was looking at. And of course, I have to say, I mean, he went through Stalin's purges. He barely survived, and so he had a lot of trauma from his own personal life. But in his fiction, he always has torture scenes in his fiction. He himself had undergone torture in the Stalin's prisons, and so he had this. So for him, fiction was not, in a certain sense, was also kind of therapy. But of course, in his books, torture is always done by the enemies of the Soviet Union. So in other words, he knew about torture, but he always said it's the other side that was doing it. So for instance, in some of his early fiction novels, you have the Japanese torturing the Koreans, you have the Americans torturing the Koreans. And so you have this effort to present something that looks realistic, but the other side is being blamed for it. And there is this very strong anti-Americanism. And so what Kim was trying to do after the war, he wanted to develop a genre of socialist spy fiction. He essentially wanted to rival Ian Fleming in the West. He wanted to create heroes who would be doing the kind of work that James Bond was doing on the part of the let's say British Empire and the British state. He wanted to have heroes like that to do the work on the part of the Soviet state. However, because he worked within the limit of the Soviet censorship, he of course had to be very careful about the good life. It's whiskey and parties and all of that. It was always the other people doing it. The Soviet heroes or the allies of the Soviets were always very rational, very moral individuals who who never drank alcohol, who thought about Marx and Lenin day and night.
Well, this is one of the things that I need you to explain to me. So, Roman Kim, as you say, he was, he got caught up in the purges, and then again towards the end of his career, he falls foul of the regime again. And he's not the only one who sees, the dark face of the totalitarian world that he lives in, and the agency that's kind of protecting and furthering that totalitarian regime, and yet seems to be sincere in his kind of, in his like patriotism towards the regime and his admiration for the service that he's also seen the worst side of. I don't really understand that, because I didn't understand how much some of these writers were sincere in their kind of admiration for the KGB, and how much they were just cynical in their portrayal of it.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. It's a huge psychological dilemma. It's drama. It's really difficult to understand looking at it from the outside, living in a completely different system, completely different period. And Kim is not the only one who has suffered from the system and yet seemed to have been a great defender of the system. What I think was going on is that he essentially attributed his suffering and the purges to some deviations within the Soviet system, and then thought that in the 1950s, 1960s, the system was getting better. The system was essentially now discovering its true identity. That those were some paths that were taken in the past, but were not going to be taken again. In other words, maybe he wanted to contribute those paths not being taken again. And it's true, when you compare the KGB to the NKVD, you see a big difference. I mean, and you can look at statistics and find out, how many people were executed under the NKVD in the 1930s and how many people were executed under the KGB for 37 years of its existence. And you'll see a huge difference. I mean, the KGB policy in the 1960s and the 1970s was something called prophylactics. It's like you talk to the people who are against you. You invite them for conversations at KGB offices. You try to influence them. You try to persuade them verbally before you send them to jail, before you send them to psychiatric hospitals. So there was this effort to be kind of softer toward the population. And this can also be seen in the KGB spy fiction. In fact, the KGB spy fiction is a sign of this softening of the relationship between state security and the population, because there was no NKVD spy fiction in the 1930s, in the 1940s. The idea was the NKVD was something nobody's supposed to talk about. This was supposed to be the realm of the state that's supposed to be feared. And there was not going to be information about it at all, except this fear that they were going to come and get you. However, in the 1960s, the KGB wanted to have a humane face. Imagine paradox. KGB with a human face. But that's exactly what they were trying to do with some of their efforts in literature. And I'd like to mention the Chekist Stories. This was a book series produced by the KGB Press Bureau. Imagine this, the KGB Press Bureau. Can you imagine Stalin's NKVD having a press bureau?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you make this point in the book that there's a sort of a shift in the mid 60s where it stops being a kind of forum for kind of individuals and veterans, and it starts being kind of KGB policy. So the KGB chief Sobchastny in the 60s, he sort of starts off a PR push, right? And then they basically set up this press bureau, and part of the remit of the Press Bureau is to kind of push these stories and create these stories and give access to the archives to spy writers who could, all of which will be censored, obviously, but it's still a kind of an a deliberate move to own this genre, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, Vladimir Semichastny was a KGB chairman in the 1960s, and I was able to find a document released by the Lithuanian archives where there's a plan, an actual plan from 1963 to 1965, where everything is written down. You know, how many radio programs, how many theater plays, how many books, who's gonna do it, who has to do it. In other words, this was a planned effort. You know, it's something they were planning to do ahead of time, and they had a 2-year plan. They had their own people who they knew could write well. They had journalists they would co-opt into working with the KGB. They had veterans who had a lot of stories to tell from their operations outside of the Soviet Union. People like William Fisher, better known as Rudolf Abel. And so it was done in a way to attract the new generation of Soviet citizens, people born after the war, like Vladimir Putin, to join the ranks of the KGB, and also for the rest of the population to be supportive of the work of the KGB. And this is something that's emphasized in the books and also in KGB documents, this link to the people. You know, how do we connect to regular Soviet citizens? How do we make sure that they see us as allies, not as enemies? And then the question is, were they successful? And the fact is that if you look at public opinion polls done after the Soviet Union fell apart, you'll see that the respect for the KGB, for their professionalism and their work, their commitment to the system is pretty high among the population. And so even though there were dissidents and there were groups against the Soviet system, the majority of Soviet citizens, and I attribute this in part to the KGB produced books and propaganda, did not really have an extremely negative view toward the system itself. They may have hated certain communist functionaries and certain inane, you know, crazy bureaucratic procedures, but the commitment to the system itself was really strong. And this again comes back to power of literature to shape reality. You know, sometimes people say, oh, no, it's fiction, doesn't matter. Well, it matters because these are references that people use in the way they understand their own reality. And just look at even in the politics of the West. So many politicians are using references from spy fiction to try to understand the real political events going on. So I would not, you know, I would not dismiss this out of hand. I think it's very, very important because this is where the references come from, the way people think. And also something that's very important is that this is, you know, we don't have a lot of information about the way intelligence agencies operate. You know, how do we learn about intelligence agencies? And most people learn about them from fiction, from spy fiction. You know, how many people learn about, let's say, the MI6 from like reading James Bond novels? You know, many more than reading Christopher Andrews books, right? So,
Right.
and this is where you get the government, the state involved. Then there is the state trying to kind of manipulate these images and all of that. Of course, in the Soviet Union, this was done, and there is proof this was done. We have no proof that this or documents this was done in the West.
So, the main kind of post Press Bureau books that you focus on are these Chekist stories that you mentioned. What was the intention behind the Chekist stories, and what particular image of the KGB was it that they were trying to project to their domestic audience?
Well, the Chekist Stories is a very important book series. It's 8 volumes of books, of short stories. There are about 60 short stories in them. And it started publishing in 1970, and the last volume came out in 1991, essentially the year of the demise of the Soviet Union. So you have these 8 volumes, and the stories there essentially cover 3 periods. The first period is the period from the founding of the Soviet Union and the first Soviet secret service organization, the Cheka, from 1917 to 1941, to the beginning of World War II for the Soviet Union. And then there is a set of stories covering the second period. This is World War II. And then the last segment is the Cold War. And I counted all the stories and read them, and I found out that most stories actually talk about the Cold War period. In other words, the KGB activities. So even though KGB always looked back at the Cheka as its kind of glorious predecessor, they still wanted to talk mostly about themselves. And in terms of the series itself, the book series itself, one of the heads of the press of the KGB Press Bureau confessed in public that this was probably one of the best PR efforts, best investment that they ever made into kind of shaping hearts and minds of the Soviet population. This was their primary interest. It was the Soviet people. None of these books were translated into English. And this is something that's very important to understand. The Soviet Union was essentially a counterintelligence state. In other words, the primary mission of the Soviet state was to defend itself. It did expand, and especially in the early period of its existence. But mostly during the Cold War, their attitude was, we want to defend what we have. And this is why the emphasis was on the Soviet people. People like Roman Kim, they wanted the Soviet state to expand. And this is why they wanted to create an equivalent to James Bond, to have a Soviet operative who's out there in the world winning on behalf of the Soviet Union. But this did not really work well with this counterintelligence focus of the KGB. And so their biggest efforts were focusing on the hearts and minds of the Soviet population. And as I pointed out before, their success there can be seen. Now, I also have to mention something that's very important: the number of copies. See, in the West, we are talking about, I mean, my book, I mean, how many copies will it have? Well, in the Soviet Union, these KGB produced books, they had hundreds of thousands of copies. I mean, we are talking about millions of books. In other words, these books were all over people, and they were cheap for people to purchase. So in other words, there was this huge effort to have as many books out there. Of course, these books had a message, a propaganda message, and this is why many people see this entire effort of the KGB as a kind of psychological warfare. And this is very important to understand. We are not talking about free literature. We are talking a literature that had a clear state-oriented purpose. However, we also have stories that are interesting because the stuff was not simply invented. The stuff was the real operations, of course, given with an ideological spin, the filter of Marxism, Leninism, and Soviet state ideology. So in other words, the KGB always tried to have some kind of a documented background and then build on it, because they understood that they had to be believable to the Soviet population. They could not invent it all, but they did spin it in a way that was favorable to their own interests.
That was what a question I was going to ask. Do we have any way of knowing about how these were received by the readers, and whether the readers understood that it was propaganda, cared that it was propaganda, whether they bought in? I mean, you said it helped shape people's idea of the KGB, as being a kind of force for professionalism and whatever, and the studies at the end of the World War, at the end of the Cold War, bear that out. What I'm not clear about is, if I'm a Soviet citizen in 1983, say, picking up one of these Chekist stories, do I how do I approach it? Like, what am I thinking when I read it?
That's a great question. I mean, we have the testimony of the big guy Vladimir Putin. We have his testimony, and I, when I say Vladimir Putin, I also mean this whole group of former KGB officers who seized power in Russia and who are still holding it. And so we have that. Now, if we talk about an average Soviet citizen in the 1980s, well, I mean, we don't have, there were no surveys at the time. And of course, the books were not expensive. So there were, families had them. Now the question is whether they read them or not. And they probably did, because they were appealing. There were stories of adventure, but mostly based in the Soviet Union. And this is something that's also very important to understand. The writers I cover in the book talk about Western agents and officers of intelligence services infiltrating the Soviet Union. So many of these stories in the Chekist Stories are about Western agents and officers being offensive against the Soviet Union, being on the Soviet territory, trying to collect and steal information about Soviet industry and Soviet military. And then we have Soviet citizens portrayed in these books as helping the KGB. There are stories, and I talk about them in my book. I analyze them where, a regular Soviet citizen is passing by a train station and notices a suspicious person, and then calls the KGB, and then the KGB officers come and take this person in. And it turns out this person is a British spy. And in other words, there is this portrayal of how you, an ordinary citizen, can be of service to the state. And of course, this character from a short story is invited to the KGB office, praised by KGB colonel, and celebrated as a great Soviet hero, a young man. So in other words, it was telling the Soviet population, here's a way you can get seen and get praised by the authorities of the state.
It reminded me, actually, reading your account, of that when I was a child, I read voraciously, and I read a lot of my dad's books, which were from, pre-war Britain, inherited from his dad. And all of those were like, brave, plucky Englishman goes out to the far posts of the empire and quells the natives. And like, they were great stories. And I didn't really, at the time, appreciate that they were also basically ideology for imperialism, which were being produced not by state direction, but certainly with the intention of making young British, boys who are going to go out and run the empire understand what their noble goal and noble quest in their life was going to be. And it struck me as being a kind of a similar thing. I could imagine being an impressionable 14-year-old, and where once you read one of those books and you want to run off and run a part of the British Empire, and equally reading one of these books and you kind of think, God, I'm going to join the KGB and be an upright, moral, defender of the Russian people.
Yes, I mean that's true. Every country has this kind of heroic tendency of praising its own, but of course here in the UK, United States, in the West, you also had an alternative. You didn't have to read Ian Fleming. You could also read John le Carré, who had a different attitude toward the work of British intelligence and counterintelligence. So in other words, you had options, you had choices. In the Soviet Union, you had no choices. There was no Soviet John le Carré. So in other words, every single KGB spy story had to end with a happy ending for the KGB. Sometimes right. Not so happy for the character, for the protagonist, who would sacrifice his life in the defense of the motherland or the fatherland, but happy for the state. In other words, and this is something also that's very important to remember, is this attitude toward its own people. The Soviet state had this attitude of essentially hey, it's okay. It's okay to sacrifice an individual so that this collective could live or could survive. So we see this also in the KGB spy fiction. We see that the KGB did not really, they praised people who were helping them, but their attitude toward the others, toward they considered traitors, was pretty harsh, was pretty brutal.
Yeah.
And so, and here we are talking about counterintelligence fiction. So we are talking about the setting of the novel or the short story taking place in the Soviet Union. And so the idea was that they would end up badly. Like if they were helping the Americans or the British, their path, either prison or suicide or essentially no happy ending for any traitors of the fatherland.
No, I can imagine that does not end well. One of the absolutely fascinating nuggets that you have in the book is that after the end of the Soviet Union, that the Chekist Stories book series obviously stops. But then the FSB, which is the replacement organization of the KGB, sets up its own literary competition in 2006, where it awards its first prize explicitly to books that glorify the FSB. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. It was like, do we need it? We've touched on how the ex-KGB officers now are in charge in Russia, but this seems to me to be very illustrative of that point, that even the kind of propaganda mechanisms of the KGB have actually survived the end of the Soviet Union.
Yes, that's a great point. That's a great point. And it's not only the FSB, it's also the SVR, Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. They also have their own contest, and they award not only books, but also films and songs and paintings and statues and all kinds of things. This goes back to the KGB mentality. In fact, already in the late 1970s, in 1979, KGB chairman Yuri Andropov had an open executive order, not a secret one. It was an open one where there was this encouragement of artists and journalists and all creative people in the Soviet Union to create work in praise of the KGB, and they were offered monetary awards. And those awards were significant. For instance, the first prize in this KGB competition was a 2-year salary, 2-year average salary. Imagine getting 2-year salary for a book or a film or a painting. And this, so once again, this is this kind of effort of the KGB to influence in a good way, to not to force them to work for the KGB, but to offer them benefits. You do something for us, and there you get money. And even though in a communist system, money wasn't supposed to be your main motivation, but by the late 1970s, the system essentially lost its ideological grounding, and then the money. And of course, KGB had a lot of money, and they had a lot of money. And then after the Soviet Union fell apart, they shipped a lot of their money outside of Russia and used that money in very nefarious ways to influence Western politics. That's a different story, but that's also the KGB. That's also so in this book I try to talk about the mind of the KGB. When you understand the mind, then you understand the actions. When you understand the culture, you understand behaviors. And that was my point. So it's essentially the point was to understand the essence. And the essence is this. The essence is the idea that Russia is attacked, and that the KGB or now the FSB, the SVR is the best defense, the most elite defense of the state is the state security and intelligence services. Yeah, I mean, Russia has a military, but the military has never been, either in the communist system or even today when Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine, it's not as important as state security and intelligence. So that's very important to understand. the military is seen even today in Russia as essentially an object to be controlled by state security. And if you want some specifics, we can talk about. Let me just mention a service called military counterintelligence, and that's very, very important. So military counterintelligence is in charge of making sure that the military is on the same page as the state. And this goes back to the Cheka. In other words, from the very beginning of the Soviet state, they had a group of people from state security in the military, making sure that the people in the military behaved according to the state policy. And this has continued without any kind of this has continued without any kind of break, even into the Russia of today. So even today, there is military intelligence, the GRU, but they are still under the influence of the FSB. In other words, the FSB can have their agents in the GRU, but the GRU will never have their agents in the FSB.
In terms of the characters in the current cultural output that's lionizing the FSB and the SVR, are they extolling the same virtues in the kind of current crop of characters in this stuff as they were in the earlier KGB days? Is there continuity of the protagonists? Are they the same kind of upright, non-drinking, noble?
Yes, they are. yes, they are. I mean, the ideology is different. In the past, it was Marxism, Leninism, and now it's essentially Russian nationalism. So in the past, the ideology was kind of more open to non-Russian presence within its universe. Whereas now it's about Russia itself. It's about the mother Russia and defending Russia itself. So the ideology is different. There is this sense in under Marxism, Leninism, the idea was internationalism. We are all in this together. It was a universalist ideology, and in fact, some former KGB officers, veterans, they kind of regret this idea of not being able to get citizens of other countries to work on them on the basis of a common ideology. In fact, it's much easier. Communist Party, there were communists all over the world, but they all had one center, Moscow, right? But now, I mean, how many foreign citizens want to work to expand Russian nationalism? Not as many as wanted to work to expand communism. I mean, that's common sense. So in other words, kind of the sphere of influence, ideological influence, has shrunk. At the same time, these officers, the FSB officers portrayed in spy fiction, the SVR, they've remained. They want to be different from the Western officers. They even though now they do drink and go to parties, they still keep in mind. We do this. We sacrifice for the state. We don't enjoy this. We don't enjoy the whiskey and all the sex. We have to do it. We have no choice. We've got, Putin, and he wants us to do certain things. So we have these rationalizations. And of course, they have to, if you read contemporary FSB spy fiction, they do have to add a lot of, they have to get rid of ideology of Marxism, Leninism. They have to focus on modern things. They do have to, in KGB spy fiction, based in the Soviet Union, you had spies, but they had to take buses, because, not many people in the Soviet Union had private cars, and taxis were not on every street corner. So you've got the Chase. Chase is actually buses, trams, metros, and that's so interesting. And also something important to mention, if we go back to KGB spy fiction based in the Soviet Union, is that KGB also wanted to project this idea that they are omnipotent within the Soviet state. In other words, they could manipulate the courts, the military, state-owned enterprises. They had their own people everywhere. They could make up any cover story they wanted. And in fact, I have to mention one person in particular, one author in particular, Oleg Gribanov. He wrote under the pseudonym Oleg Shmelyov. Why do I mention him? Because he was the head of KGB counterintelligence, of the second chief directorate of the KGB from 1956 to 1964, at the height of the Cold War. Imagine all those things, you know, Penkovsky, the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK assassination. This person was in charge of the KGB counterintelligence at that time, and then he was fired from the KGB due to certain internal issues and also connected to some defections. And then he had a second career in literature, and he, with a colleague from the KGB, also retired. They began producing counter-spy fiction. And this essentially was an extension of his own life as a KGB counterintelligence chief, where he himself planned operations in Moscow against the Western diplomats, using all these things. You know, in other words, he was able to create in real life the kind of setting, fictional setting. And this is something that's very important to understand about KGB counterintelligence, that they created situations and spectacles in real life that resembled fiction, that led to the blackmail of many Western diplomats. We all know the story of Maurice Dejean, French ambassador to Moscow, who was essentially entrapped by a good-looking Soviet actress, and then later on essentially became subservient to Gribanov. And John Barron wrote about it back in the 70s, and his account is the best. But there were many others. So in other words, this creativity of some people from real life later was expressed in fiction, because to be a good spy, you have to have a literary imagination. Because what's a cover story if not a fictional story that you have to live within?
You call him, Gribanov, you call him in your book, I liked this quote, you call him a man of remarkable creativity coupled with manipulative cynicism and brutality. I thought, wow, I'm not sure I'd like to hang out with him. And he also, in his books, I like, so you talk in his books, they're kind of morality tales aimed at young people as well. And any young Soviet person in his books who kind of is attracted to Western consumer culture ends really badly, don't they?
Yes, that's true. Gribanov was so well known in the counterintelligence circles and intelligence circles in Europe that Markus Wolf, the head of the HVA, the Stasi, foreign intelligence agency in East Germany, called him the teacher. So in other words, and I was able to locate a transcript of a meeting that Gribanov had with other leaders of Soviet counterintelligence in 1955. I found this in Lithuania. I got it from the Lithuanian archive, and there in this transcript, they all speak in their own voices. This was one of my most amazing discoveries, is that for the first time here we have them speaking. This is a transcript of their meeting. And there we have Gribanov saying, you can come to work every day on time. You can do everything by the book. But unless you are creative, you are not going to get far in this business. So in other words, this is Gribanov
Amazing.
telling his colleagues, you know what? Creativity is the key to success. Literary imagination is the way you win on the invisible front of espionage. And he was ominous and devious, but he was right. He was right. And in fact, it's a good advice to all the spies and counter spies out there.
Filip, okay, we're coming to the end of our time, but I did want to ask you one quite difficult question. You've read so many books for this project, clearly, all in Russian. Are any of them actually any good? Or does writing on demand, on propaganda demand, mean that you can't write a good book? Would you like to see any of these translated into English as a kind of literary event?
Well, I mean, I spent a lot of time with these books, and there are some interesting elements about them. You know, it's like they do have persuasive quality. I would not nominate them for Nobel Prize in Literature because they were written under constraint. They had certain conditions that they had to fulfill. But the stories they tell are interesting, and they do give you an insight into what they were doing and how they were going about it. So if you want to study the methodology of the KGB, and when we talk about the methodology of the KGB, we also talk about the methodology of the FSB and the SVR today, because remember, the same people, Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB, is a former KGB officer. He came out of this milieu. Sergei Narishkin, the head of SVR right now, he came out, also former KGB officer, came out from the same milieu, you know, influenced by romantic spy stories from the KGB. So this is why they're important. Some writers are better than others. Some writers, and those good writers were actually assisted by the KGB. They were noted, and they were people like Roman Kim. You know, they were there. They were supported. They were in a certain sense encouraged to do what they did. However, without kind of the critical aspect against the system wasn't there. But there was this machinery of the state that you could see. Only one book out of all the books that I covered in my book, only one book has been translated into English. It's a novel by Gribanov and Petrochenkov. It's called Resident's Mistake, and it hasn't been. It's been translated. You know by whom? By an organization affiliated with the CIA. So, in other words, it's not out there in public. It's just you can find it. It's been declassified, but it's a CIA translation. And this novel is about somebody coming from the West being sent to the Soviet Union of Russian origin, a Western intelligence officer of Russian origin being turned by the KGB. And this is something that's very important to remember. And I have come across a lot in KGB spy fiction. This idea of dangles. You know, you essentially have an agent or even an officer in some cases pretend to defect to the other side, to want to work for the British or the Americans, and that while at the same time working for the KGB. This is something that I think even today can be seen or should be seen as one of the main orientations of Russian state security and intelligence services: infiltration and penetration of enemy services.
Absolutely. Listen, Philip, we're reaching the end of our time now. Another reason I love your stuff is that I follow your Substack, and you also have a blog. Just tell people where they can find you online, because you're always unearthing the most extraordinary KGB stories. I love them.
Yes. You know, what I love to do is I like to dramatize the archival files. You know, I want to make them come to life. So what I do, I go to archives and I find all these interesting stories, and then I write about them on my Substack, KGB Stuff by Filip Kovacevic. It's easy to find. If you just go to Google, type in KGB Stuff, you'll find it. I also have a blog called the Chekist Monitor, and there you can find some of my older stories about my archival discoveries. But my intention is essentially to give life to these voices. So I have a lot of stories, and we'll continue doing this in the future, where I essentially talk about completely unknown operations of the KGB counterintelligence or intelligence and the predecessors of the KGB, and essentially tell them in a way that are appealing to readers and can kind of give you a sense what it was to be working for the KGB and also to being an enemy of the KGB at the same time, because they make mistakes. I mean, it's not in the files you see the truth. You see that sometimes they were successful and sometimes they failed horribly and they were demoted and they were fired because they failed. And sometimes they failed because they were incompetent, and sometimes they failed because they were just not lucky. And this also happens in intelligence business. It's not only about skill, it's also about, being lucky. And it makes it very complex. We talk a lot about intelligence failures and successes as if it all could be planned. But, KGB wanted to plan everything. They had 2-year plans and 5-year plans. But the fact is, when you read the files, you've got to be inventive and think on your feet. Just as Gribanov said, unless you are, you can come to work on time and do everything by the book. But unless you have this spark of literary imagination, hey, your enemies are going to win.
I think that's the moral of all life. And don't let the enemies win. Keep the imagination alive. Filip, on that note, I would like to say thank you so much for coming on Spymasters. It's been an absolute joy to hear you talk about your book. So thank you,
Antonia, the same here. Thank you for having me.